I'm Jim Bohanon, and this is Westwood One. Every now and then, this program will take a look at conventional wisdom and expose it as perhaps being conventional ignorance. It happens, and we'll be doing some of that tonight. Let's go back to the conventional wisdom, something that I don't suppose we've ever really talked about before on this program, but that would be the view that the Catholic Church in World War II looked the other way as the Germans pulled off the Holocaust. And as our guest historian Mark Riebling says, in fact, that is not true. In his book Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler, published by Basic Books, he says, in fact, Pope Pius XII carried out a very active and in some cases violent war against the Nazis. Quite a tale. At the time of World War II breaking out, the Catholic Church had just chosen a new pope who took the name Pius XII. The Vatican was officially neutral. The Church had an uneasy relationship with the Axis powers in Europe, of course surrounded as they were by one of the Axis powers, the fascist state of Italy. Despite being the only world leader to publicly denounce Nazi crimes against Jews in his 1942 Christmas message, Pope Pius was roundly criticized for not speaking more frequently and more strongly against Nazi war crimes, especially the horrors of the final solution, the Holocaust. It's been repeated many times since the end of that war, but we're learning more and more about the actual relationship between Pope Pius and the forces fighting the Nazis. We're going to be learning even more tonight with Mark Riebling, historian and policy analyst and author of the book Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler, published by Basic Books. Thanks for being with us.
How are you, Jim?
Very well, thank you. And I'm curious about this. How did the story grow that essentially the Catholic Church officially looked the other way?
Well, the story actually began, this myth that Pius XII was pro-Nazi, in 1963, and his reputation was essentially ruined by a work of fiction. There was a play by a left-wing German playwright, The Deputy. It was a very famous, scandalous play. And by today's standards, it reads kind of mildly, but it simply said, at one point, a Jesuit priest says, a pope who remains silent with such horrors beneath the very window of the pope, talking about the deportation of Jews in Italy in late 1943, such a pope is a criminal. And at the time, Jewish organizations were up in arms over this, and they protested and tried to prevent the play from going on in Broadway, and the Anti-Defamation League opposed the production of the play. And this really began a debate, and actually, in a certain way, the 60s really began not with the free speech movement in Berkeley in 1964, but with the attack on the symbol of conventional authority, the Pope, in 1963. And basically what it said is, your father's generation were all Nazis, and the Pope means father. Later on, when you see The Graduate, they say plastics. The older generation's all plastic, phony, fake, Nazi. Even in American Beauty, the villain is revealed as this closet Nazi at the end. So this has become a standard motif in our culture, but Pius was the first one to be hit with this. And it is true that by today's standards, he wasn't explicit. He did mention the word Jew in the first month of the war, in his first denouncement of Nazi policies. But after that, he didn't use that exact word until the war was over. And one of the discoveries of my book, Church of Spies, is that on the last day in the war that he said the word Jew, that was the first day we can document his contacts with the German conspirators trying to kill Hitler.
Now, something we should keep in mind here, obviously, one thing you have to note about the Vatican is what Stalin once noted when noting papal displeasure with something that Stalin had done. His reply was, how many divisions does the Pope have?
Yeah.
And, of course, if you exist in a world of might makes right and power is everything, then the answer is obviously nothing. The Swiss Guards really don't add up to even probably a platoon of troops. So there is that factor. Although, obviously, Italy was an ally of Nazi Germany, and clearly the Vatican was totally surrounded by this ally, I have never known for sure the extent to which that alliance included heavy anti-Semitism in fascist Italy. I don't know the extent to which, for example, Mussolini collaborated or sent Italian Jews up to be put into the Holocaust. I'm just not sure. I know that it was not a, quote, nice regime, but I'm not sure exactly the extent to which, for example, Mussolini would have even been terribly upset if the Pope had talked about Jews much.
Well, I don't think Mussolini would have been upset, but he was very cowed by his German superior allies, and it was clear that the Gestapo and the German Foreign Ministry were putting heavy pressure on the Italians, because by nature the Italians were not anti-Semitic. In fact, the Jews in occupied Europe had the second highest survival rate in Italy of the entire continent. The first was in Holland. But I hate to say only 10,000 Jews died, but compared to the millions in other countries, there was one big deportation occurred in October 1943. The train went straight to Auschwitz, and it's true the Pope worked behind the scenes to try and mitigate that. Instead of hundreds of thousands, 10,000 went. And there's a big debate about whether the Pope's silence there saved many, many lives or whether he's liable for the 10,000 lives that were lost. Personally, I don't think, knowing what we know about Hitler, that anyone's protest would have deterred him. But there were cases in which the church sort of threatened to denounce publicly and the Nazis backed down. So this is a really dicey issue, and it certainly is the overall context which surrounds the controversy about the wartime Pope. But one of the things I really pursued in Church of Spies was this idea of a bipolar or two-track policy. One was public and the other one was private. One was above the line, the other was below the line. So my book really is kind of a spy thriller, but it's all based on documents and stuff following what happened below the line.
Indeed. In fact, the title alone, Church of Spies, there are those out there who might say, well, what does that mean? And I gather that one could summarize Church of Spies in a way as referring to the world's largest church, smallest state, and oldest spy service. I'm not Catholic. I have not often thought of the Vatican as being on a par with the KGB, the CIA, M5, or Mossad, but are they?
Well, in a way they really are. In a certain way, they're even better because they're not encumbered by a huge bureaucracy. They have global reach, upwards of 1 million potential informants and agents, just if you think of priests and nuns all over the world with a reason to be there without worrying about the normal problem of cover that an intelligence organization would have. But their organizational footprint is really zero. But it kind of goes to show that you don't necessarily need a bureaucracy to get something done. And one of the interesting things I discovered in researching Church of Spies was that if you think about it, for the first 300 years of the church's existence, the church fathers had no idea that they were going to go on and become the official religion of the Roman Empire, which happened in the 4th century. So for those first 300 years of the church, they were an underground organization. They were meeting on the run at night in crypts and catacombs, using secret insignia to communicate, meeting, having mass in safe houses. And so they developed something called the discipline of secrecy. But what it basically says is that there are a lot of things classified secrets. Even the Our Father was top secret. And in fact, if you think about it, the Bible itself was classified intelligence until Martin Luther came along. So it's in the DNA of the church. I think especially when the church is under pressure, as it is even today in Russia, China, Cuba, I guess it's almost like when you heat something in a test tube in chemistry class and it reverts to its primary elements. Well, that's kind of what happens to the church when it gets into these terrible moral crises, I think.
Church of Spies, the Pope's secret war against Hitler. The subtitle is apparently not hyperbole. It was a war. We are talking with historian and policy analyst Mark Riebling, who's written on national security issues as well as the history of the Vatican during World War II and the Cold War. He co-founded the Center for Tactical Counterterrorism, also served as research director for the Center for Policing Terrorism, National Counterterrorism Academy. And now he has written a remarkable book that takes a look at what actually happened as regards the Catholic Church and World War II. This secret war of the subtitle of your book, Church of Spies. Gun-toting Jesuits stealing plans for Hitler's homes. That reads like something out of Ian Fleming.
Well, it really does, and it's quite remarkable. These are colorful characters. One of these priests who was part of the conspiracies to kill Hitler had spent a Good Friday in a saloon. Another one was a pilot, and he liked to do loop-de-loops over the student assemblies of the Catholic high school. One Jesuit individual recalled the hair stood on the back of his neck one time as Hitler's motorcade drove past because he had this fantasy that he would run over Hitler and kill him. So these were not necessarily the normal men of God that you think of, but they were highly motivated, and it's almost like jihad. It was a religious war because we had two all-embracing ideologies which each demanded the soul of the whole man. And it kind of came to a crux when the Nazis invaded Rome in September 1943, and the image that I would just give listeners is on one side of a white line at St. Peter's Square was a line of Panzer tanks with their barrels pointed at St. Peter's Basilica. And on the other side of the line were the Pope's Swiss guards with their 15th century armor and their medieval axes. And this was kind of a mismatch in military terms. But you used Stalin's quote, "How many divisions has the Pope?" But Churchill's rejoinder to that was that the Pope's divisions are not of this world. And so certainly they were invisible divisions, that they were spies. Pius XII had been the papal agent in Germany, reporting back in code to the Vatican throughout the 1920s. And one of the things he did then was follow Vatican instructions to thwart Hitler's first attempt to come to power in 1923 in the Beer Hall Putsch, because they regarded the Nazis as neo-pagans. And this was a correct diagnosis that most other people missed. And so the future Pope, Pius XII, carried out the instructions of the Vatican to work behind the scenes without showing its hand, without saying anything publicly, asking individual priests to engage in efforts to make sure that Catholics didn't support Hitler. Hitler found out about this, and he never forgot it. And one of the things that occurred to him was that if he could sort of neutralize the church, this would remove certain problems for him. So Hitler, when he came to power in 1933, did a deal with the church to respect Catholic rights, supposedly. The Vatican signed this agreement, but at the same time developed an extensive intelligence network to try and verify whether or not Hitler was actually abiding by the agreement, which of course he was not. They were doing all kinds of things to try and turn Ascension Day, for instance, into the Feast of Thor's Hammer, and were intimidating Catholics and beating up Catholic workers. And so this became actually quite violent. And by the time the war broke out and the Nazis went into Poland and began shooting hundreds of priests, there was a full-on war between the Church and the Reich, although publicly there was amity. But behind the scenes, the Pope was working with the German resistance to Hitler from October 1939 until there was a bomb that exploded in Hitler's briefing on July 20th, 1944, which wounded Hitler.
To what extent did the Catholic Church have anything to do with that briefcase?
Well, the holder and bearer of that briefcase, who was played by Tom Cruise in the movie Valkyrie, Klaus von Stauffenberg, was not only a Catholic, but he was what I would call a deep Catholic. He had a stained glass mind. He actually was quite inspired by St. Thomas Aquinas and the Catholic doctrine of tyrannicide, which specified the conditions under which religious Catholics could remove wicked secular rulers. And there was a Jesuit priest, Alfred Delp, who met with Stauffenberg on D-Day, June 6, 1944, as the Allies were invading France. These two met in Stauffenberg's home, and the details of this conspiracy, which was to culminate in the briefcase bombing, were discussed, and Delp came out of that meeting beaming, and he told a witness, he said, "I've done more today than I've done in my whole life, and it's going to happen soon." And so essentially the Jesuits in Germany, reporting back to the Pope through a line of communications, were encouraging and sponsoring and acting as intermediaries, but more than that, they were actively engaged in designing a post-Hitler order, and they came up with ideas which were quite prophetic and actually came to pass, such as Christian democracy, European unification, the euro. All of these things were initially discussed in the Vatican crypt in July 1942.
And I want to come back and talk about all that post-war influence that may have come out of all of this in just a second. But to go back to the briefcase bombing attack, that the Vatican influence encouraged the bomber?
Yeah, well, there's sort of two answers to that. First of all, by analogy, I'd say, let's say there were people in Russia today, in Moscow, who wanted to get rid of Putin. But they didn't know how to contact the Obama administration to have a regime change because they wanted help. So they decided to go through Pope Francis. And let's suppose that Pope Francis said, okay, and he went to Obama. Well, this is pretty radical. So it shows certainly being an accessory, being the plotter's foreign agent, helping them get peace terms with the West, which was how the Pope initially got involved. There's that thing, which includes an implicit sanction or approval if this world's most famous and prominent religious leader is becoming involved in political violence. The implication is that he approves. Second of all, the Pope's stormtroopers, as the SS called them, the Jesuits, were so deeply involved that really you have to look at it as almost a Jesuit and military plot within Germany. And this was quite important because the Jesuits could bypass local bishops. They reported not through the bishops, who were in some cases sympathetic to the Nazis, but right past them. So it gave the Pope an independent line of control over what the Jesuits were doing.
Now, you mentioned that change in the management of Italy, when it was no longer Mussolini running Italy after the Mussolini regime collapsed, and the Nazis, who were, of course, there fighting with their Italian allies, suddenly became the people in charge. Anywhere in Italy that they were in charge, they were completely in charge. The new Italian government was formed, but there was no longer Mussolini as an active ally. If Hitler had known all of this, and you were talking about anti-Nazi activities by the Catholic Church going back as far as 1939. This is 1943. Why, given Hitler's, shall we say, lack of concern about public opinion, you got Nazi tanks right there surrounding the Vatican? Why didn't he just go in? I mean, what did he care if the world said, oh, you shouldn't do that?
Well, it's a great question, Jim. There was actually a plan that Hitler came up with and assigned to an SS officer to invade the Vatican with paratroopers, seal all the exits, kidnap the Pope, bring him back to Berlin, and then the plan was to, after the war, execute the Pope to inaugurate a new soccer stadium in Berlin. This was Himmler's idea, the chief of the SS.
Well, everybody loves a party.
Right. So, I mean, this is sick stuff. But what happened was that in a meeting in July 1943, when all this was first planned after Mussolini fell, due to a conspiracy in which the Pope actually played a role, Hitler had reports that the Pope had helped to overthrow Mussolini, and he said, I want to go into the Vatican. You think the Vatican concerns me? Essentially just what you said. But what happened was that on July 26th, 1943, Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, and Ribbentrop, his foreign minister, according to the primary sources, they talked Hitler out of it because, and this is a direct quote, because of the effect our measures would have on world opinion. So in the end, the Nazis at this point, because they were really losing the war, they had lost on the Eastern Front, the Russians were coming, and now they had lost Italy, they were really felt in an unstable position. So they were at this point thinking, well, maybe we can do a separate peace with the West. And they knew that the Pope, even if you weren't a Catholic, the Pope was a certain symbol of something, of religion, and that it would have, he's a symbol of Christianity, certainly. He even was to the Protestant conspirators in the military resistance. So the effect on opinion in the West, world opinion in neutral countries, it would have made life a lot more difficult for the Nazis. Nevertheless, they sustained intense persecution against the church and arrested just thousands and thousands of priests and harassed them. They arrested bishops, and it was really almost bordering on a full-scale religious war.
Now, among other things that appear in Church of Spies, you mentioned the Catholic book publisher who flew a sports plane over the Alps with the secrets taken from the head of Hitler's bodyguard. Tell us more about this particular devil-may-care person.
He's really the hero of my book in many ways. His name was Dr. Josef Mueller. He served as the secret intermediary between the Vatican and Catholic agents in the Reich. He was a real beer drinker and a kind of man sprung from the people that the Nazis really loved to claim as their own. And as an opponent, he kind of daunted them. And so he was, in fact, the Pius XII's best secret agent in Germany. He flew over the Alps in a single-seat sports plane with a briefcase full of reports almost on a weekly basis. He would fly. He would land in Murano, Italy, and the courier would take these reports down through the Italian leg to Rome, and there they would be stored in a hollowed-out book on the top shelf of the Pope's library. So they had a very elaborate clandestine reporting system. Joey Ox, as his fellow Joseph Mueller was called, made over 200 trips to Rome during the war as a Vatican agent. He recruited the head of Hitler's bodyguard as an informant. He also recruited as an informant a self-styled Nazi nun named Sister Pia Bauer, who had been the only woman to march with Hitler in his failed beer hall putsch in 1923, and she had been wounded in this escapade. And to get information, she had the condition you had to meet her in this side room of a certain bank, and she would hike up her skirts to show the scar she'd received on her buttocks, which she was in the habit of doing so often that she didn't even wear a panty, according to the sources. So these, again, were colorful people on both sides, and Joseph Mueller worked his way very deftly through this moral twilight of living in the Reich and not being arrested and nominally working in German military intelligence, while in fact being a Vatican mole and spy.
Wow. With gun-toting Jesuits, next you'll be telling me about Mata Hari nuns.
Well, you know, there were reports at the time of Hitler's invasion of France in May 1940 that the Germans were parachuting from the sky disguised as nuns, and these rumors were rampant in Paris, and I certainly didn't find anything like that. But I did find that there was a Jewish lesbian who'd been married to a Nazi who converted to Catholicism and became a courier, and she was a very important figure along with Joseph Mueller. She unfortunately died at a concentration camp when her non-Aryan status was discovered in 1942. But this is just really a mosaic, an incredibly diverse mosaic of conspiracy. And one of the things that the Jesuits in particular were good at is they would be in disguise. They would pretend they had girlfriends and stroll with Catholic secretaries from the parish office to fool the Gestapo, or if they had to visit Joseph Mueller in plain clothes in his law office, they'd say that they'd come to see about a divorce. So they actually were kind of playful in their covers and role-playing. But it became dead serious in 1943 when the Munich Jesuits pilfered the blueprints to Hitler's bunker in Munich, which was then under construction. There had been a dispute because apparently the Jesuit sewage was leaking into the SS barracks, which bordered the Jesuit college in Munich. And in the process of a lawsuit over this, the Jesuits had obtained the blueprints to Hitler's bunker and passed them to the conspirators in German military intelligence, where they were then part of the planning to kill Hitler in 1943.
Unbelievable. You mentioned these reports that were flown over the Alps would be taken to the Pope's private library and hidden in a hollowed-out book, which prompted me to wonder, you've talked so much about Catholic infiltration of Nazi organizations. To what extent did the Nazis and or Italian fascists infiltrate the Vatican hierarchy? Did they have spies planted within?
Well, they did. They were more successful in Germany in penetrating the German bishops' conference. There was one priest who ran a Catholic charity, and he was compromised by two married women who sexually blackmailed him, and so he provided information. And there was one Austrian bishop that Pius XII particularly distrusted as being sympathetic to Nazism. So when he came to the Vatican in 1939, the Pope was meeting with the German cardinals, and this cardinal from Austria was along, and Pius XII was so suspicious that he then decided to secretly bug and tape his meetings in the Vatican, and he installed a secret taping system to record his meetings with these cardinals because he didn't want them to go back and misrepresent what he'd said. So this was sort of like Richard Nixon, very extraordinary, making secret tapes, and I actually was able to find the transcripts of some of these and translate them for the first time in Church of Spies, and they reveal the Pope's deep involvement in details of clandestine operations, for instance, explaining how to support a clandestine courier network by skimming Catholic charities and telling which hotel in Munich the courier should stay in and things like this. It's almost, they're bantering as if in a kind of clerical locker room. But your question about the penetration of the church is an interesting one. I think they were less successful, the Nazis, in Rome because it's a closed society, and it's really difficult to sort of walk up to the gates of the world's oldest institution and worm your way in. As there's a saying in Chicago, nobody wants somebody that nobody sent, right? And so you can't just go down to Carmine Street and knock on the door.
Church of Spies, the name of the book. Lucy in Charleston, South Carolina. Hello.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. A most interesting subject. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the famous Lutheran minister who was in on the plot to kill Hitler. I wondered how much he had to do with the Catholic Church, and I will hang up and listen to my radio. Thank you so much.
Well, Lucy, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who's a very famous figure, a Protestant theologian, and very influential after the war, his role in these plots was very deep, and his connections with the church were very close. In fact, I uncovered evidence that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was really considering converting to Catholicism in the spring of 1941, and there were documents that went to the Vatican. They sent back, they said, well, here's the forms in which he can apply to convert and become a Catholic priest. He ended up not going through with that, but he did meet in the Vatican crypt at the site of this secret wartime dig for the bones of St. Peter, which were going on underneath the high altar of the Vatican. He met there along with Joey Ox and some other German resistance members, both Protestant and Catholic. They met with the Pope's Jesuit advisors to coordinate regime change in Germany. And Bonhoeffer, from at least October 1940 up until his arrest in April 1943, was a very close ally. And in fact, the interfaith amity which we see today under Pope Francis reaching out at Ground Zero to representatives of other religions, and we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the Catholic change in the Vatican in October 1965 made tolerance an actual point of doctrine. This all came and began, as Pius XII himself said, it all began with this kind of lifeboat ecumenism where people were almost, this was a perfect moral storm. And so rather as in Noah's Ark, when there's this deluge, people had to come together. And meeting in the Vatican crypt, this was, when Bonhoeffer was there, this was absolutely instrumental in forming the idea that people of different denominations could work together against a common enemy. So Bonhoeffer is very important in my book.
Church of Spies. Well, we'll cut to the chase. The Nazis lose, okay, if you didn't read the papers. And then out of this, of course, comes a new post-war Europe. And I gather that Mark Riebling in the book Church of Spies, you indicate that a lot of things, the euro, the common market, a lot of things maybe that happened in post-war Europe were a direct result of the Catholic Church's war on the Nazis.
That's certainly true. There were other things which were direct causes, but one of the major, certainly, shaping forces of the post-war order was the decision by the U.S. occupying forces, and particularly by Allen Dulles, who was the American spy chief in Europe operating out of Switzerland, to use what Dulles called the crown jewels. And these were anti-Nazis who had survived the war, were taken up to a castle in the Alps in the last days of the war and were supposed to be used as hostages. And if they couldn't be used as hostages to get passage to South America for certain high-ranking Nazis, well, they were to be machine gunned, and so that they couldn't help rebuild a free Germany after the war. This is the ultimate vengeance. So a mission was mounted to try and liberate these crown jewels. And they were saved. And among them were a number of Catholic priests, important Catholic politicians who'd been jailed. And the influence they brought to bear was quite remarkable. If you look at what they were proposing, even in June 1945, when they were being debriefed on the island of Capri in Italy, they were proposing one European currency. They were proposing basically what became the European Economic Union. And these are quite advanced ideas. They were controversial, but the leader for them, and he's known as the godfather of the euro, was Joey Ox himself, the liaison between the anti-Hitler plotters in Germany and the Pope in Rome. The ace of papal spies, really. He goes on to rebuild the post-war order in Germany. He becomes Minister of Justice in Bavaria and metes out justice to many of the surviving Nazi war criminals. And he really builds up what came to be called Christian democracy in Europe, which really dominated European post-war politics during the Cold War, which was a kind of vaguely leftist, in economic terms, a political coalition of Protestants and Catholics, but very anti-communist. And so the United States backed this with funds, and in fact, Joey Ox was on the CIA payroll as an agent codenamed Robot during the time he was bringing all this about. So this was with U.S. sponsorship, but Vatican ideology in a way.
So are we to say that the war of Pope Pius XII against the Nazis led directly to Lech Wałęsa and the Solidarity movement in Poland?
Well, it did, with a heavy assist from Pope John Paul II, who actually helped the Polish Solidarity movement align with the CIA and approved the CIA support to Solidarity, CIA partnership with the Vatican. So this definitely did come to fruition in the collapse of the Soviet Union eventually.
Anything else that we have not covered? There's so much in this book, Church of Spies. Any other key elements that you'd like to point out in the time remaining?
Well, I'd just say that, some people would say, well, Mark, isn't this just a defense of the Catholic Church's, silence in the Shoah? Are you carrying water for the Catholic Church, or is this just an apology? And I'd say, I don't see it that way. One could actually say that this is, in a certain sense, a critique of the Catholic Church generally, with maybe a reevaluation of Pius XII in particular. I think that the reality is that Pius XII saw that he had a weak hand because the Nazis were so popular. Up until Hitler started losing the war around the time of Pearl Harbor, when the United States came in, he was the most popular person who'd ever lived. And I think the Pope, the tapes he made in his own apartment clearly show he was worried that the German church was going to break away like the English church did under Henry VIII in England in the 16th century. And this was a great concern. If you're the Pope, you don't want to lose souls that way. And so he decided to act behind the scenes while having a kind of above-the-line peace with Hitler. But behind the scenes, he was very actively involved. And this shows that sometimes things are not always as they appear. I think that Pius wanted to lead a church of saints, but in the end, because he was uncertain about the loyalties of German Catholics, he decided to lead a church of spies.
The book is Church of Spies, published by Basic Books, and quite a read.